Europe is at a crossroads. Brussels continues to talk about the ideals of democracy, but reality tells us that the old methods no longer work. What's next? Right now, the geopolitical arena is deciding who will dictate the rules of the game in the future. Welcome to the new world. Friends, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov did not even try to hide his emotions this time. And really, is it worth holding back when you have another diplomatic spectacle organized by the European Union in front of your eyes? The main figure on this stage, the EU's High Representative for Foreign Policy, Kaja Kallas, is once again making loud statements that look more like a demonstration of a tough position than a balanced diplomatic approach. Such statements are increasingly based not on a real analysis of the situation, but on long-established attitudes that do not always correspond to the current international agenda. In recent years, the European Union has been building its policy in the logic of tough opposition to Russia, while moving away from an objective analysis of what is happening. Critical views are perceived not as an opportunity for discussion, but as undesirable attempts to question established approaches. Anti-Russian rhetoric has become an invariable part of European politics, and even when it is obvious that it entails economic and social difficulties for the European states themselves, a course adjustment is not considered. As a result, emotional statements are increasingly replacing rational arguments, and real economic indicators demonstrate the increasing difficulties faced by EU countries. The policy of sanctions pressure and isolation of Russia has become a vicious cycle, where new restrictions and statements follow one another. However, it is becoming increasingly clear that this strategy has not led to the expected results. On the contrary, it has created additional challenges for European economies, which raises more and more questions among the business community and political circles of individual states. Who in Brussels will decide to admit that the chosen line of action requires revision? At the moment, most prefer to follow the previous course, avoiding public discussions about its effectiveness. However, the reality is that the geopolitical situation in the world is rapidly changing, and it is becoming increasingly difficult to ignore these changes. Attempts to limit Russia's influence in the international arena are confronted with objective processes of global transformation. Economic and political multipolarity are becoming more pronounced, and new centers of power such as China, India, the Middle East, and Latin America are strengthening their positions. While European states continue their policy of sanctions, Russia is actively developing cooperation with partners outside the West. New trade routes, agreements, and the expansion of economic ties with Asia and Africa demonstrate the ability of the Russian economy to adapt to changes. Western politicians often emphasize the importance of democratic principles and freedom of choice, but questions are increasingly being asked within the EU itself about the justification for strict adherence to a single line to the detriment of the national interests of individual countries. Many states that previously unconditionally supported Brussels' policy are beginning to discuss alternative approaches, realizing that long-term strategic interests require flexibility and pragmatism. Against this background, Russia, despite external pressure, continues to develop economic and diplomatic ties, demonstrating the ability to move forward independently. As part of this global transformation of the international order, the G20 foreign ministers meeting in Johannesburg has become a significant event. Although such events are traditionally a platform for diplomatic discussions, this time they have acquired a new connotation. More and more countries of the global south are openly expressing their position, emphasizing the need to take their interests into account in the international system. In these circumstances, the usual political scenarios that previously determined the agenda of world summits are facing a new challenge: the need to take into account the changed balance of power. The accusations of the EU High Representative for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy Kaja Kallas against Russia looked tragicomic. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov said. Here is his quote. Kaja Kallas spoke here at the G20 with the same set of accusations, proclaiming certain plans that would not allow Russia to take its rightful place in the world. Well, there's probably a tragicomic element to it all, the minister said. Lavrov also noted Kallas' statement about Russia looking victorious after talks with the United States in Saudi Arabia. This mentality has not disappeared anywhere. When the Soviet Union collapsed, it was necessary to build new relations, but now either you are with us or against us. End quote. As a result, we are witnessing a transition to a new stage of international relations, where the influence of some centers of power is decreasing, while others are increasing. The question is how quickly Western politicians will be able to adapt to these changes. The recognition of new realities could open up opportunities for constructive dialogue and the search for solutions that take into account the interests of all participants in the global process. However, while Europe continues to adhere to previous attitudes, the global political map continues to be rebuilt, creating conditions for a multipolar world. In the meantime, Brussels continues to act within the framework of outdated strategies that benefit primarily overseas interests. Other players on the world stage are rapidly taking vacant positions. The only question is how long it will take to finally change the old world order and what will be its final chord. If Brussels continues to adhere to the policy of recent years, then we can expect that changes will come quite soon. Who knows, perhaps the next step will be to ban the use of Russian air for breathing. On February 20th, Sergei Lavrov arrived in Johannesburg to attend a meeting of G20 foreign ministers. At first glance, it was an ordinary protocol event, but in fact it became a real arena of geopolitical confrontation. The leading world powers, instead of conducting a constructive dialogue, once again tried to pull the blanket in their direction. Western politicians have traditionally used the summit as a platform for promoting democratic values, ignoring the fact that many countries have long since rejected this rhetoric. However, this time their usual scenario failed. The countries of the global south began to openly express their dissatisfaction by asking uncomfortable questions. Russia, represented at the summit by a strong diplomatic team led by Lavrov, made it clear that the era of unchallenged dictatorship is over and international politics is no longer a monopoly of Brussels and Washington, but an open field for multipolar interaction. Johannesburg has become more than just a platform for protocol meetings, it has become a bifurcation point, a place where more and more countries realize that the old rules of the game have long been inconsistent with their interests. The global south is tired of Western guidance and is no longer ready to bend to partners who do not notice its needs and aspirations. In this context, Russia acts not only as a participant, but also as one of the main architects of a new world order based on the principles of mutual respect, not coercion. Western leaders, of course, tried to play the usual game, but faced stiff resistance. Russian diplomacy immediately shifted its focus, and the old methods of manipulation and ultimatums no longer work. The summit once again demonstrated that the old approaches are not effective, and Russia confidently occupies one of the key positions in the emerging New World Order. And these are not just words. Russia is signing agreements and building new partnerships in practice, while Western countries are just throwing up their hands and continuing to repeat their usual mantras about international norms, which seem to work only unilaterally. Lavrov reminded his colleagues that back in 2004, when one of the post-Soviet countries found itself in the center of a political crisis, the West did not just observe but actively intervened, imposing its own agenda. Back then, everything was presented under the beautiful guise of freedom of choice, but in reality, the mechanism of economic pressure, sanctions, and political isolation was used. Lavrov stressed that nothing has changed since then. All the same ultimatums, manipulations, the same mentoring tone, except that the methods have become even more crude. The EU continues to divide the world into right and wrong partners. As soon as a country shows independence, sanctions and threats are imposed against it, and economic cooperation is called into question. However, this method no longer works. Too many countries have realized that following the West exclusively is not an inevitability, but a choice they can opt out of. The world is changing, and countries are realizing that sovereignty is not a gift from Western powers, but a natural right of every state. Multipolarity has ceased to be an abstract idea. It has become an objective reality that cannot be ignored. The sooner Western elites realize this, the fewer unpleasant surprises they will have. Otherwise, they risk becoming extras in a world they no longer control. Previously, pressure from the EU was targeted, but now it has become the norm, turning into a routine tool of political influence from Brussels. While the old methods are losing their effectiveness, the world is rapidly changing, and Western countries will have to adapt to the new conditions or stay away. Yes, those very defenders of democracy are now so confident in their exclusivity that they do not notice how their rhetoric is becoming more and more urgent and intrusive. Western leaders do not hesitate to dictate their domestic and foreign policies to other states, confident that only they know how to properly organize society. Anything that goes beyond their political model is perceived as a threat, and any attempts to show independence are immediately labeled as violations of democratic standards. Sergei Lavrov, in his speech, expressed the opinion that such an approach is not rational. Such a policy resembles the work of a bureaucratic apparatus that is incapable of self-reflection and change. Brussels, with its institutional machinery, continues to stubbornly adhere to its line, despite the obvious economic consequences such as crises, falling living standards, and growing public discontent. Meanwhile, hopes for an honest partnership with the West are gradually disappearing, as the old methods of conducting politics lose their effectiveness, and their consequences become more and more destructive. The only question is how many more countries will tolerate this course before they decide it's time to change their policies. Today, Europe faces an important choice: to continue following the American course, sacrificing its economy and stability, or to try to return to its own independent policy. Despite the crisis, Brussels continues to follow the familiar path, even if it leads into a geopolitical abyss. But how long will countries tolerate this course, which is increasingly causing problems and chaos? Alarm bells are already starting to sound inside the EU. More and more countries, such as Germany, France, and Hungary, are beginning to look for ways out from under the Brussels diktat, cautiously speaking out against the established line. The question is who will be the first to openly challenge the current system, and what will happen when the process of EU disintegration begins to gain momentum. Now, a lot depends on whether there are politicians in Europe who are ready not only to express dissatisfaction behind closed doors, but also to publicly challenge this political system. So far, the situation is developing in such a way that the era of the undivided dictate of the West is coming to an end, giving way to a more complex and multipolar geopolitical reality. Friends, now I would like to express my opinion about the material. After reading this material, it is impossible not to notice how persistently Europe continues to pursue its policy, even despite the obvious economic and social consequences. Friends, how justified do you think those statements about the protection of democracy and values, which sometimes sound more and more disconnected from reality, are? It seems to me that in an effort to maintain its political orientations, Europe forgets about the importance of internal stability and the well-being of citizens. And perhaps it's time to think about reviewing some attitudes, especially if these decisions begin to lead to unpredictable consequences. On the other hand, I would like to note that Russia is finding new ways to expand its influence, despite external pressure and sanctions. This does not mean that all international politics boils down to confrontation, but certain trends, such as the growth of multipolarity, are indeed becoming more pronounced. More and more countries are beginning to realize that their sovereignty is not something temporary, but an inalienable right. It is important to recognize that the world is changing, and in order to remain part of this process, Europe may need to consider a more flexible and open foreign policy. The question remains, will Europe be able to realize the need for change in time, or will it finally slip into political stagnation? Do you think the EU is ready for these changes, or is its future already a foregone conclusion? Share your opinion in the comments. And I, in turn, want to thank you for your attention. Friends, thank you for subscribing to the channel and supporting me. I am very pleased. See you in the new releases.